J.R.R. Tolkien is largely known for his Lord of the Rings books, which was subsequently made into films, which were subsequently made into long lists of trivia that people can recite from heart. Did you know that Viggo Mortensen broke his foot when he kicked that helmet? Did you? Did you? But, as well as being a great author, Tolkien was a scholar and a literary critic, and one of his most famous essays on fairy stories deals with a pretty big question. What are stories, and fairy stories in particular, even for? And although the topic of the essay focuses on fantasy, most of Tolkien's observations apply so much more widely than this. So today, we're going to take a look at why literature and storytelling are so very valuable, using not just Tolkien, but many other authors as well. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Making the world afresh. In Albert Camus' novel The Stranger, Meursault, Camus' strange and indeed estranged protagonist, declares that, after a while, you could get used to anything. It was an old piece of wisdom passed down to him from his mother, and Meursault uses it to comfort himself while he rots in prison. I do understand the comforting side of this phrase, but it also has a slightly disturbing flip side to it. After a while, we can become accustomed to any situation, so that situation becomes mundane to us. What was exceptional just the day before has now become just a normal life. This same insight has been expressed many times in many different forms by many different thinkers. Epicurus pointed it out over 2,000 years ago in his analysis of the insatiability of human desire. But we could also think about more modern discoveries like the human drive towards novelty and how we often gloss over repeated experiences in our memory formation since we see them as nothing new. There's something about humanity's endurance here, the fact that we can bear quite a lot of things because we can get used to them, but there's also something in here about our tendency to forget or skim over all the potential richness of our everyday experience. Our attention is bored with the familiar long before we've actually exhausted and extracted all its value. Tolkien's essay contains a variety of different ideas, and we'll come back to many of them over the course of this video. But I think my favourite one is this effect that fiction can have. Good storytelling can make the world fresh, and it does this by making our experience strange again, or as Tolkien puts it, recovering our experience. I'll quote his essay directly since, Tolkien can put things much better than I can. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need, in any case, to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. This blur of triteness or familiarity, which is just such an amazing phrase, is exactly what we've just talked about. The tiredness with which we see those things that we have seen many, many times before and will see many, many times again. Tolkien here is focusing on fairy stories and fantasy, and yes, I do think that that is especially suited to his point. Take his world of Middle-earth, for example. When I've just read a section from one of the Lord of the Rings books, which have quite a large emphasis on describing nature in that particular Tolkien-esque, spirited, enchanted way, it actually does change how I will see the trees outside my window. In fact, as I'm writing this on a rather dreary February afternoon, I can see the trees gently swaying in the rainy breeze. Of course, I can't see them now because I've got the curtain shut to record, to balance the lighting. But when I was writing this, I could see the trees. And ordinarily, the trees would not have caught my eye. But after putting myself in the mind of Tolkien and his world temporarily, they suddenly appeared just that bit more fascinating than they were before. The trees don't just look like they were passively swaying in the wind, they sort of seem like they're reacting to the wind. One of them looks a bit like it's turning away to hide a particularly bare part of its trunk, while another, a slightly more brittle tree, looks as if it's putting up a rebellion against the chill. It looks like it's standing tall and prideful to let the breeze know it's unbothered. Obviously, I don't actually believe the trees are willfully doing this sort of thing. My point is that inhabiting Tolkien's mind has temporarily made the world a bit more beautiful, and it's forced me to take a familiar sight, the trees outside my window that I see literally every day, and make them strange again. Many of us think that, at some level, being present or being in the moment is a desirable thing. But this is often reduced to a thought-terminating cliché unless we're given a detailed idea of how to actually be present or what this state can consist of. And sure, there are ways of training this directly. Meditation is one of the most popular. But another way to approach this conundrum is to figure out a way to make the present moment itself more compelling. And one way to do this is to make it strange and so recapture this sense of novelty. It is taking something mundane and making it new again. And in doing so, it makes it much more naturally attention-grabbing. In this way, storytelling can free us from that blur of triteness that Tolkien talked about and, in a purely perceptual sense, seem to give the world its enchantment again. And although Tolkien is talking specifically about fairy stories and fantasy, I don't think that this observation is at all limited to that genre. For example, I've mentioned on the channel before that I think Tolstoy has a particular gift for taking characteristics of people that we might ordinarily consider either irritating or boring or off-putting, and somehow, through his particular use of descriptions, making them both compelling and just sort of cute, endearing. I don't know how to put it any other way. What is previously negative becomes sort of attractive as we see it from a slightly different angle. And beyond this, at least in my experience, literature and storytelling has the same effect that many forms of learning have, of enriching our experiences by just giving them more points of comparison and analysis, more little aha moments during the day. You might meet someone and realize that they share some qualities with an admired character. And beyond just arousing a positive sensation in you, it also adds this extra layer of associative richness to the world. This is by no means limited to literature, but I just have found that literature is a particularly potent way of adding this sort of multi-layered lasagna of associations that help reality become that bit more compelling. And sure, this all may sound a little bit frivolous. Making everyday experience potentially more attractive or making it feel more rich is hardly saving the world or inventing the cure for cancer. But I think we really have to bear in mind that the world of everyday experience is the world in which we spend most of our time immersed in. If we can make it a bit richer, then that is a huge benefit over the course of our lives. Literature and storytelling help give the world a kind of meaning topography, so to speak. Certain parts of it become more associatively rich than other parts, and thus more compelling and felt as more, I kind of hate the word, but I'm going to say it anyway, meaningful. I'm not suggesting that the answer to existential problems is just to read more literature or simply embrace storytelling, though we will be moving on to the more existential components of storytelling later in the video. Instead, I'm just saying that it can lend a greater sense of felt significance to our experiences, especially the ones that we have become more familiar with and thus have become so mundane that we don't even notice them anymore, and that this, I think, is a more significant boon than we might initially think. When Tolkien says that fairy stories allow us to see the world like children do, I don't think that he means that it reduces our understanding of the world and makes it wondrous again in that way. I think that it's almost trying to get the best of both worlds. We have all of the adult knowledge of knowing about this stuff in the world, be it a tree or a person or a flower or a kettle or a cup of tea or what have you, but we now have the wonder reinserted into it. So we don't make it strange again with ignorance. We find a way to have both knowledge and novelty at the same time. I'm not 100% sure that I got that across all that well. It may be one of those feelings that is almost impossible to put into words. But just try reading a passage describing nature from Lord of the Rings and then go for a walk in your nearest familiar natural landscape. And I think you'll understand what I'm driving at. And to move slightly beyond Tolkien's essay, I actually think that the impact of storytelling has a deeper level, even to the level of our self-conception. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 2. Stories of the self. This is kind of an odd question, but how do you know who you are? After all, you commit thousands of tiny actions every day, but only a small percentage of those are ones that you consider essential to your character. Each morning, I make a coffee in my French press, but I don't consider that action part of who I am. I don't identify with it and perceive it as a core part of my character. If one day I were to stop doing that and I instead became fond of instant coffee instead, I wouldn't think, oh my god, I'm a whole different person now. But there are parts of all of us that, were they to change, we would be devastated about. We'd kind of grieve an old self. Say you were to realize one day that you were actually quite cruel to the people around you and that you'd never noticed this up until now, or that you were a Christian and one day you fell out of faith. These are the kinds of changes that give people fundamental crises of character because they consider them changing something close to their identity. But this sort of raises an obvious question, right? What is this identity made of? It would certainly be an exaggeration to say that identity just is a collection of stories that we tell ourselves, but it wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration. I was surprised at just how important storytelling was here, because narrative is one of the tools that we quite heavily use to sort through the overwhelming amount of information that is absorbed by our senses each day and then translate it into something that we can make sense of and then make use of. This can sound a little bit abstract, but it's something that we've all experienced. We fall in love, and we almost unconsciously cast ourselves in the role of the lovesick romantic hero. We are told that we are worthless by an authority figure as a child, and we internalize that message, interpreting our experiences, that is, our experiences going forward, through this narrative assumption that when someone admires us, we are deceiving them, and when they condemn us, they are right. These are stories that we tell ourselves about our own lives. And there does seem to be something about stories that just strikes the human mind as particularly prone to carrying significance. It's no coincidence that the way oral societies tended to transmit information was through really quite elaborate narratives. For whatever reason, stories seem ideally placed to help things stick in our minds. When we recall a particular event to mind, we're not actually recalling it as it happened. We're telling a slightly altered story about it. As the psychologist Robin Fivush puts it, autobiographical memory goes well beyond memories of past experiences to create a uniquely human story of self. A narrative that defines identity in relation to previous experiences, future plans, families and friends, communities and strangers, creating coherence through an evolving sense of meaning and purpose in life. That is, it is through our own storytelling about ourselves that we come to have a coherent and hopefully emotionally satisfying view on life. Without this story, we just don't have an understanding of ourselves in the way that we would normally think of it, if that makes sense. We do have examples where someone has almost totally lost their ability to tell autobiographical narratives, but I'm not really sure how applicable that is to those without those specific pathological conditions, so I won't dwell on that too much. One thing that I did notice that I thought was really interesting, and I can't think anywhere else in the video to put it, is that greater narrative coherence is correlated with higher levels of general well-being, though it's important to note that correlation isn't causation, and the causation could run both ways here. The overall point that I really want to get across is just that storytelling is a big part of how we make sense of ourselves. A narrative doesn't just shape our sense of, me, I suppose. It also shapes our sense of we. That is, we also tell stories about the groups and communities that we belong to, and these shared narratives are a pretty significant part of what binds our communities together. It's probably worth saying here that narratives of the self and of the group can be both desirable and undesirable. Just as an autobiographical story which paints us as a helpless victim or as inherently superior to others probably wouldn't be helpful, we can also have very unhelpful group narratives. A group narrative like, my group is so much better than all others and deserves to squash them like bugs beneath our collective boots, can and has had truly horrific consequences, as we've seen many, many times throughout history. So here, in this realm of community storytelling, we can return a little bit to Tolkien's original essay and his famous image of the cultural pot. This is his term for the collections of stories, characters, lessons, structures, and ideals that make up our cultural understanding of our place in the world. As time goes on, we take things out of the pot and we put new things into the pot. At one point, the idea of the hero leaving their home and going out on an adventure got put into the pot. At another point, the idea of a loving couple separated by cruel external forces got thrown in there. At a different point, maybe quite later on, we added the narrative of not peering too far into certain parts of the world too hastily, lest we find something there that frightens or disturbs or destroys us. And this particular narrative, to, I imagine, very few people's surprise, became much more prominent in the 19th century. The pot's precise contents won't be the same century to century or even year to year, since our context and our culture are fluid things. But the contents within the pot provide a framework for the people who can access the pot through which we can process the world around us. This touches upon something that the philosopher Charles Taylor discusses in his book A Secular Age, which is what he calls our social imaginary. A social imaginary, broadly construed, and I am simplifying it somewhat here, is the set of underlying assumptions about how to conceive of us and the world and the relationship between us and the world. It's quite an opaque idea when it's presented in this abstract way, but with an example it becomes pretty intuitive. One of Taylor's many arguments in A Secular Age, it's like a massive 800-page book, is that our social imaginary changed throughout the 15th to 18th centuries in a variety of key ways. We ceased to think of the world as filled with spirits and agential spiritual forces, and instead began to see it as a rationally ordered whole, more amenable to a kind of minimal philosophical deism than a personified theism. We also began to think of us as creatures capable of self-governance without direct appeal to things like spiritual texts, or a collective idea of a mythic past where the strictures of our society were laid down for all time. In other words, what it meant to be a human being, and particularly to be a human being in our idiosyncratic social context, shifted pretty significantly. And a lot of this was to do with the stories we told ourselves about what a human life consisted of within our societies. So it required a totally different narrative regarding what a good human life looked like and what our role in whatever social position we found ourselves in, and even what a society as a whole was capable of doing as time went on. And, Taylor's not saying that this was just an ideally driven shift. This is happening in consort with, is that the right term? Yeah, consort with material forces as well. For Taylor, the difference between a medieval society where appeals to tradition were grounded in God and sacredly held authority, and, say, 1776, where the founding fathers of America argued for their independence partly on the basis of the public will and the right of a people to self-determination, is at least partly a change in the narratives and societal stories at play. As I said, Taylor's not claiming that the narratives were like a neat causal force that created the physical changes. Ultimately, he thinks, and I broadly agree, that processes like these that are so vast and happen over such a long period of time are probably too complex to make neat causal judgments like this. However, this connection between narrative and community doesn't need to be as grand or as sweeping as this. When you get together with an old friend, one of the first things that you're very likely to do is reminisce about a story from the past. I met up with an old school friend very recently, and we probably spent about an hour of our chat just talking about the experiences that we had already shared together. They form a kind of touchstone for the loose community of people who were in my year at my school. And over time, they become almost myths, right? Certain stories become exaggerated. They take on outsized significance, or they're attributed a gravitas that they really haven't earned if we were looking back on it with a cold and sober eye. But in the process of swapping and crafting these stories, we bring ourselves closer together. A lot of social bonding activities have this storytelling component where either a new story is created or old stories are retold. This is true both of more traditional social activities like rituals, which are often based around reenacting a semi-legendary story from the past of that society or culture, all the way down to a modern-day Dungeons & Dragons session where, in effect, we come together inhabiting different characters to create new stories around these characters. This process can just happen sometimes without us realizing it, but my personal hope is that by experiencing and reflecting upon storytelling, we will be able to more consciously choose and shape the narratives and stories that we build ourselves and our communities around. My wish, I suppose, is that we'll develop a kind of self-awareness of the stories that we're creating, and then we can start to ask questions like, are they desirable to us, or are they getting in our way? And funnily enough, I also think that literature is a great weapon in our arsenal here. 3. Alternative stories. Recently, I've been reading the science fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin. I read her fantasy series Earthsea as a kid, and I haven't read too much sci-fi, so I thought that since I already knew that I was a fan of the way that Le Guin wrote, I would start with some of her sci-fi novels and try to kind of broaden my literary palette. This is, as it turns out, a fantastic decision, since Le Guin has such an excellent way of crafting her novels sort of to challenge the parts of our world that we simply take for granted and give us a bit of critical distance from them. One of her novels, the one that I'm reading at the moment, is called The Left Hand of Darkness, and it asks what, on the face of it, is just a rather strange question. What would it be like if, instead of being born as male or female, there was a race of creatures who were ambisex and celibate until they changed into being male or female once in a while and bred simply in that short time window? The story has one regular male human called Genli I who interacts with this alien race, which is so nearly like us, yet so vastly different due to this one change. We get to see how different social structures might be if we had these alternative characteristics, and we also get to see just how odd our societies look through the eyes of this alien race, the Gether. For example, since they are celibate most of the time and neither wish to reproduce in these long barren periods nor can do so, they look on Genli I as a pervert and a sexual deviant, and would look upon us in much the same way. The Left Hand of Darkness is generally a really great novel. I'm really enjoying it. And one of its real strengths is that it makes our default way of doing things and living in the world seem temporarily odd. We are presented with an alternative world and an alternative culture, which would view us as strange and aberrant. And this is great for reflecting on all the things about our world that we take for granted, that could change or could potentially be challenged. It doesn't necessarily actually challenge them, nor mean that they have to be changed, but it does raise the question. Like Socrates, it simply asks, why this way when things could have been so different? One of my favourite parts of The Left Hand of Darkness is the concept of Shithgrethel. This is the Gethen word for their particular idiosyncratic honor culture, and it's basically incomprehensible to our point of view character for a large part of the novel. Le Guin grew up around academic anthropologists, and it really shows. You truly get a sense of having to figure out this alien culture for yourself. And for many people, seeing the slightly odd practices of Shithgrethel that seem totally arbitrary through our human eyes, but that also gradually come into focus as the novel plays itself out, put some reflective distance between us and our own codes of manners, honour and politeness. Again, this isn't just to destroy them without thinking, but it does give us a bit of distance from them so that we can examine and question them, but also see how those parts that do seem strange to us may have made sense under different circumstances to different people who had different aims to us. Through creating this alternative world to our own, Le Guin gets us to take what I can only describe as an empathetic critical stance towards our own culture and values. And this allows us both to question what we've been given, but also to understand what might be behind the aspects of our culture that might have previously seemed arbitrary or groundless or just don't make sense to us. This is just one example, but it illustrates what I think is quite an important point. In the first section, we talked about how fiction can make familiar parts of the world seem strange. And there we talked about how they can use this strangeness to re-imbue the world with a sense of magic and novelty. But here, we're using that same sense of strangeness to do something slightly different. Here, the created oddness allows us to inhabit the perspective of a visitor to our own world and see how we would react to that. It's a kind of experiment in judgment, an opportunity to see the world from a slightly different angle. And if it's the right angle, it might just change the way you look at things. If it doesn't go that far, then it might still make you ask a question that you haven't asked before. Either way, it is a worthwhile exercise and something that literature and stories are so very well placed to do. This questioning doesn't need to happen on a societal level either. A lot of the most valuable thought chains, I suppose, that I've got from fiction have been in inhabiting a different perspective, but within our world, or inhabiting the perspective of someone in an unfamiliar situation. Take the character of Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. When he murders the old pawnbroker and is tormented by feelings of fear and guilt, it forces me, as the reader, to ask questions like, how would I react in that situation? Is my conscience at all in my control, or would it torment me against my will if I acted in certain ways? Did Raskolnikov's reasoning for killing the pawnbroker make any sense at all, or does any kind of ethical reasoning in this cold, calculated manner always leave something out? Dostoevsky, of course, has his own answers to these questions, but I'm more interested in just the fact that he makes us ask them, and so in turn makes us reflect upon our own mind, with all of the beliefs and values that we may have left undisturbed until now. Or, to use a more modern example, let's take Sally Rooney's 2018 book, Normal People. This follows two young people who are deeply in love, but are also deeply dysfunctional, in ways that are, at the same time, thoroughly mundane. These are dysfunctions that you will have come across at some point in your life. From a reader's perspective, it's really quite easy to spot how our protagonists make their life worse in 100 different ways. It seems bizarre to our third-person perspective that they can't work out their issues, or even really realize what those issues are. But then, reflecting on that obliviousness forces us to recognize how mysterious a person can be, even to themselves, and how there are parts of us that we've never examined that deeply, but probably have outsized effects on our lives. By the end of Rooney's book, you're left questioning all of the ways in which you are like the protagonists Connell and Marianne, both in a more straightforward way if you happen to share their particular psychological problems, but also at a meta level, in that we too harbour deep pockets of self-ignorance in ways that we're not necessarily even aware of. It forces us to interrogate ourselves in all the ways Connell and Marianne just can't seem to. It's not like we'll discover all of our hidden depths in this search, but we are, in reading the book, alerted to an ignorance that we may not have been aware of before. Of course, a natural response to all of this is to say something like, why do we need a whole novel to communicate this point? And I think that broadly the reason is that, I sort of feel like I say this in every video now, but we are not merely proposition processing machines for whom questions are automatically motivating and who will take an intellectual challenge seriously just because someone has posed it to us. The advantage of having such reflections and questions wrapped within a story is that a story, provided that it's written well at least, will bring all of our affects and instincts to bear on a particular question or conundrum. Compare the trolley problem, which is often looked upon as a bit of a joke and most non-professional ethicists will just think of as an interesting tidbit, with Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, where she talks about a town that is made a paradise by the constant suffering of a single innocent child. I've seen people tear themselves apart over that story in a way that they simply do not about the trolley problem. And granted, as I've talked about before, there is a lot more to Le Guin's fable than just this utilitarian calculus. But it is an aspect that I've seen people obsessed over, and I do think that it illustrates this overall point that wrapping a question or an ethical dilemma within a compelling narrative structure just captivates people that bit more. It makes the questions more difficult to ignore. To use another example, we could look at The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, which is another fictional tale about a town, but this time it's a town that sacrifices a single resident of that town each year by lot. Supposedly, this is to ensure that the harvest will be sound and prosperous. Many people come away from reading such a story tormented by questions about their own complicity in mobs or in ritual violence in a way that I've just not seen people do when I just ask them about these topics directly. Because, as we touched upon in the last section, we are storytelling creatures. There is something about a good, well-crafted story that helps make these questions salient to us. It's why there's such a full stock of philosophical novels, because it is through these characters and how they play out different perspectives that we often learn to care about a question that may have previously struck us as obscure or as otherwise irrelevant to our own lives, despite the fact that it is actually deeply involved with our life. So, given how motivating and orienting our internal narratives about ourselves and the world are, we sort of need, in my view at least, these potential counter-narratives and alternative stories in order to question and challenge the narrative that we already have, and potentially revise them if we find that the challenge sticks. By refusing to engage in this storytelling, or refusing to think about stories at all, we're not washing our hands of the whole messy, irrational affair. We're just allowing whatever narratives we have already imbibed go totally uncontested. There is no option where we just don't have narratives and where we approach the world merely through propositions and facts and logic. We're sort of stuck with stories. And if we think the whole business of storytelling is just beneath our consideration or silly, then I think ultimately we'll just condemn ourselves to being the passive receptacle of the stories that we've already been told. To fend off another potential critique, when I talk to people about literature and storytelling and its value, I sometimes get the response that anyone can write a story about anything, and that's often used to dismiss the possible interest in stories altogether. But I do think that that is undoubtedly true, right? There are stories written by all kinds of different people that say all kinds of different things, and it's a mistake to think that just because something is in a really good book, that means it's true. This is why, in this section, I wanted to emphasize the questions that great stories force us to ask, rather than the answers they give us. I would obviously never want people to uncritically absorb stories as if they are proven airtight mathematical results. But I do think that they are excellent for highlighting ideas and questions that we may not have thought to consider or ask, because we have this common sense narrative bubbling in the background that will otherwise just go unchallenged. And if anything, I think that the fact that anyone can tell any story they like only strengthens my argument for becoming aware of the stories that we tell ourselves, both individually and societally. Because there's no reason to believe a priori that those particular stories are true, or that they're necessarily the most helpful ones available to us. It could be that we've absorbed all kinds of really destructive narratives, because, as the critiquer points out, it is perfectly possible to tell a very compelling story around something untrue or unhelpful. But this isn't a reason to discard storytelling. If anything, I think it is a reason to pay it much more attention, right? Imagine if there was a natural resource that could provide lots of cheap, clean energy, but if we misunderstood it or lost control of it, it could cause off-the-scale level disasters. We would surely want to understand this natural resource in as much detail as possible so that, well, ideally, we can put it to good use and avoid bad uses. This is effectively how I see storytelling. It's not that we suddenly abandon our critical thinking when we encounter a compelling narrative. That would obviously be a disaster. But since stories are such powerful cognitive and affectual technologies, and since we are stuck with them anyway, isn't it better to study them and immerse ourselves in them and how they work so that someone else isn't able to feed us a story that's not good for us without having alternative stories on hand to challenge and complicate it? But So far, we've largely been looking at stories from the perspective of someone reading it or otherwise experiencing a story that's already out there in the world. But to conclude, I want to look at why we ourselves should also become storytellers. 4. Storytelling and joy. Recently, for an unrelated project that I'm not going to tell you about yet, I've been reading through the diaries of Franz Kafka. And what's really stuck out to me, even more so than reading his letters, was that he really did burn with a desire to write. I've read parts of the diaries before, but this is my first time reading them from start to finish, and this just sticks out as a theme, right? Even when writing itself is tormenting him, he still seems to prefer writing to not writing. For him, it almost seems like writing purges something inside. When he finishes a story, especially on the rare occasion it's a story that he's really proud of, he writes like he's 10 kilos lighter. Kafka had a rather tortured relationship with his writing that I've talked about on the channel before, but ultimately he did love it. And when he wasn't writing, he was even more distressed than he was. He just had quite a high level of distress more generally. Poor guy. And the more I thought about it, the more that I realized that lots of other storytellers or authors that I happen to have read or read about describe either a real joy in their creating or this kind of purgative effect of creating. I've certainly experienced this more generally in my own nonfiction writing. Writing is honestly my favorite thing to do, and I become very antsy if I don't do it for a few days. But I'm talking specifically about those authors who primarily write fiction, which is just not my ball game at all. I'm absolutely awful at it. For instance, something that's not often discussed in The Myth of Sisyphus is that Albert Camus calls the act of creating stories the absurd activity par excellence, and views a kind of free creation as one of the most difficult, but also potentially joyous states we can achieve. You can see Camus the novelist blend through here, and you can feel his own passion for stories that he knew in his heart of hearts were meaningless, but nonetheless still desired to write. Clearly, the act of creating stories was part of what allowed him to imagine Sisyphus happy. Through his own private writings, we know just how many of the questions and problems that Camus himself struggled with in his private life made it into his stories. And this too speaks to the cathartic nature of crafting a story. It's partly through his novels and his plays that Camus wrestles with the questions of his life. Even something like Plato's dialogues are, at least partly, semi-fictional conversations where Plato, the author, inhabits different points of view, and through the course of this conversation, uses standard storytelling devices like perspective taking to wrestle with this philosophical question that's often posed in the first part of the dialogue. Nietzsche wrote a lot of philosophy in a non-storytelling way, but he seemed to consider his greatest gift to the world to be Thus Spake Zarathustra, a narrative exploration of much of his philosophy. In his work more generally, he employs all sorts of devices, both rhetorical and literary, that we normally associate more with fiction. And in Ecce Homo and parts of Beyond Good and Evil, he explicitly says that he feels he would be unable to adequately express his philosophy without these. And I totally believe him here. Would Nietzsche's philosophy be complete without this particular, if not narrative style, then rhetorical and literary style? I think that it's quite difficult to imagine that it would be. Even if we could extract all of the propositions from what remains, it's clear that, at the very least, he would consider himself to be inadequately expressed. And this seems to be the through line through many of these authors. Part of storytelling is self-expression, as well as self-creation. Although our stories, especially those we tell about ourselves and our environment, form part of our identity, they're also a creative act that allows us to partake in the sheer joy of making something. To return to Tolkien, I sometimes think about the origins of The Hobbit as a series of bedtime stories that Tolkien would tell his children as they went to sleep. As his stories evolved and he wrote The Lord of the Rings, he's become a comforting and challenging bedtime storyteller to millions. I wonder how much joy has come from Tolkien's storytelling here, and I also wonder how much joy he felt in creating all of this. We must also remember, as Tolkien says in his essay, that for him, writing and storytelling were also expressions of his own deeply held Catholic faith. Storytelling was, for him at least, the joy of expressing his most deeply held values and of glorifying the God that he so loved. At least it was that among other things. And it's this straightforward joy in creation and storytelling that I want to end on. Partly because I think it's something that we often forget when we're having these kinds of discussions about the value of fiction or storytelling or literature or whatever you want to call it. We can spend a lot of our time discussing how storytelling structures your life, or how shared narratives bind communities together, or about how storytelling can enhance our experience of the world around us in this wonder-imbuing way that we discussed in the first section. But there's a danger that we're missing the obvious point right in front of our eyes here. Storytelling is partly so valuable and so worth learning about because we love to tell and hear stories. In some ways, doesn't it feel perverse that this has become such a minor point in our discussions around storytelling and literature? Imagine if we had a philosophical discussion around films, where we talked about all of the interesting ways that camera angles can frame things, or how perspective is used to communicate particular worldviews, or how the prevalence of film in culture has changed the way that we perceive the world, and so on and so forth. I don't actually know much about film theory, so I have just pulled those out of my arse. But imagine we talked about all of that, and we never mentioned the simple fact that films are fun, and that we enjoy watching them, and that enough people enjoy making them that they will, sometimes against their own best interests, work hundreds of unpaid or severely underpaid hours just to create them. I'm currently working on another video about the pitfalls of self-help culture, and I'm going to spoil a tiny bit of that video here, so when I post that, forget that I've said any of this. Effectively, one of the main issues that I have with totalizing self-help culture is that it forces us to justify our actions purely in terms of grand personal goals, like improving ourselves in the long term or becoming our authentic self, often to the point where it forgets simple joy. I am all for things like delaying gratification and the like. I think those are really important skills to have, but we're also not going to live forever. And so surely there is something wrong with an approach to life, or inquiry in this case, which spends all its time thinking about these broader or higher goals to the near total exclusion of things like simple happiness and enjoyment. What's the point of all of this delaying if the final promised day of joy never arrives? We're not immortal. I don't feel like that's a particularly controversial thing to say. And so there has to be some provision for enjoying the present. So can we just take a moment to recognize that, apart from the philosophical depth that can be present in great literature and the importance that storytelling has to our lives more generally, all of which I think are fascinating and important, stories are a source of simple, straightforward joy. I'll give you another example to broaden out from literature and think about stories more generally. When I was a little bit younger, in my teenage years, I think it was about 17, 18, my little cousin, who at that point was like 6 to 8, used to insist that I pretend to be the big friendly giant when I played with her, which is a character from a Roald Dahl novel. And she would take a real, uncomplicated and profound happiness in this game of storytelling and imagination. Imagination just is joyous, and it's something that I rarely see full-grown adults embracing, very much including myself. But I think that here, the child is wiser than we are. We shouldn't just discard the fun imagination simply because it is silly and it's not the kind of thing that adults do. If you've ever spent time around a young child, maybe you have siblings or children of your own, then you'll have first-hand experience of just how much happiness for them springs from simple imaginative play, from telling stories and inhabiting characters and creating this technicolored panoply in their mind's eye. So I suppose what I really want to say is, become some kind of storyteller. I'm not going to tell you to go and try and publish some fiction or even show anyone. As I said, I'm a terrible fiction writer myself, and though I do write some fiction, none of the stories that I write will ever see the light of day, I assure you, because they are just awful. They're trite and cliche, and you'll just have to take my word for it, because I'm not going to show you. But I still take joy in the act of creating these stories, and I think that you could as well, right? It is It is fun and playful to exercise your literary imagination. It's fun to craft characters and to make them interact. You can even take something like your favorite book series or video game or film and put the characters from there in different situations. You don't even have to write it down. My little cousin certainly didn't. I just think that it's worth experimenting with using your imagination as a source of joy again, in a way that was probably really natural and unforced when you were like 8. One section in Tolkien's essay is on the ever-controversial topic of escapism. And sure, we probably don't want to escape into our imagination or our stories to the point where we totally neglect reality. But why? When life is full of challenges and can seem relentless, at least at points, why can't we spend some time in the quiet repose of our own mind's eye? Tolkien sees nothing wrong with it, and I really think that it might just be a kind of sense that this just isn't the sort of thing that adults do that prevent us from embracing this source of happiness. So, ideally, I would like to see imaginative storytelling reframed as an eminently acceptable thing that we can and do carve out some time for to create some happiness in what can be otherwise quite stressful lives. Whether this takes the form of immersion in a novel that someone else has written, or just laying back and telling ourselves a story as we go to sleep. I just don't think that we need to view this as childish or immature or escapist in a bad way. We don't chastise someone when they're praying or meditating because we recognize that these are activities that, depending on the person's particular belief system, will deepen their joy. And I suggest that we view our engagement with stories, even stories we are telling ourselves in the walls of our own minds, in the same dignified manner. And I think that, at the very least, that will give us another source of simple joy. I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that. But if you want to see a more no-nonsense and less fluffy pitch for the value of fiction, one that takes a more straightforwardly empirical approach, I have a video for you right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.